Hello, welcome to part 8 in a series of videos on athletic ability and how we see athletic ability using vibrational astrology. What I'm going to do in this video is show you quickly the patterns in the 8 other greatest athletes. I've shown the patterns in the 6 greatest athletes. These are the athletes that showed up as listed in 2 websites. Now these additional 8 were listed only in 1 website, so using my criteria for what we consider to be a great athlete, these did not appear in both lists, so I'm considering them to be a second level of greatness, I guess. This is not an extremely formal study. I just went to 2 websites to get an idea of who people consider to be the greatest athletes of all time. Certainly these are very good athletes. One of the athletes that showed up in one of the lists is Tom Brady, a quarterback in American football. Here's Tom Brady's 7th harmonic chart, and his 7th harmonic chart shows athletic ability, especially in a sport like American football, very strongly because Mars and Uranus are involved. It's a kite pattern, a grand trine with a 4th planet making sextiles to 2 of the planets in opposition to the others. So it's a kite pattern. You'll notice some of the lines are not extremely thick, means it's not an extremely strong pattern, but it meets our criterion. All of the planets, 4 planets, all within orb in the 7th harmonic. So we have Uranus, Pluto, opposition, and Mercury, Mars are the other 2 planets. Also, he has 5 planets, not just 4, but 5 in a string pattern. String means equally spaced, where midpoint structures are formed. So Mercury to Uranus to Mars. Uranus is in the middle, same distance, and then continue along. Mars to Sun, same distance, and Sun to Saturn, and they're all power planets. This is mind-boggling. So Mercury, Uranus, Mars, Sun, Saturn, all close enough to being the same distance. It's about 58 degrees. So it's a sextile minus 2. So it's 58, 58, 57, and 19 to 14. Well, the Saturn, I guess, is the weakest of them. Looks like it's only 55, but still gets involved in a midpoint structure. And so 4 of them very strongly the same distance, and then 1 slightly different, but 5 planets with direct midpoint structures and making midpoint structures, and they're all power planets. So that's a very strong indication of extreme athletic ability, and it fits the kind of sport that he's in, a power action kind of sport. Now, Franz Beckenbauer, one of the greatest footballers, what we would call in America a soccer player of all time, and his 4 planets are in the 21st harmonic: Mercury, Mars, Uranus, and Pluto. So there they are, a T-square of Mercury, Mars, and Pluto. Again, this is the 21st harmonic chart, and Uranus at the midpoint of the Mars-Pluto making semi-squares. And the Uranus-Mercury aspect, you see, is a thin line, weak, and just still within orb. So not only is this 4 planets all within orb in the 7th harmonic, all 4 are power planets, it's also a pyramid pattern, because Pluto is at the Mercury-Uranus midpoint, and Uranus is at the Mars-Pluto midpoint, and those orbs are, well, the Pluto at Mercury-Mars orb is 1.5 degrees, that's not that strong, but the Uranus at Mars-Pluto, 9 minutes. So in addition to being a 4-planet pattern, there's one very strong midpoint structure, another one, 1.5 degrees is not that strong, but probably adding a little bit more to it. But it meets our criterion, 4 planets all within orb. Also, one of the planets, Mercury, is also involved with 2 other power planets in its own little pattern: Mercury, Jupiter, Saturn. So here's, if, for example, one of these aspects was out of orb, the Mercury-Uranus is barely within orb. We also have the additional rule that Mercury forms, in this case, a strong pattern, sextile trine, with Jupiter and Saturn. So he just has talent all over the place. Very, very strong indications. Jack Nicklaus, the golf player, was selected as one of the greatest athletes of all time. In his 35th harmonic chart, we see Sun, Mars, Saturn, and Uranus, but one of the aspects is out of orb. So we have Uranus, Saturn, Sun, Mars, and the aspect that's out of orb is the Mars-Saturn square, which is way out of orb. And so this opposition is weak, so it's kind of a loose pattern, but according to our criteria, only one aspect is out of orb, and we do have the Sun. Where's the Sun? In a grand trine with two other power planets, and look at that grand trine. Very strong. So a very solid grand trine to the Sun. So one of the planets aspects two other planets, and wow, does it aspect them? It's a grand trine. So that's going to strengthen it. We have, we meet our criterion of 4 planets, and in aspect, one of them is out of orb, so we do get one of the power planets aspecting 2 other planets, but it aspects them big time. Also notice that Uranus is opposite the Sun-Mars midpoint with a 23-minute orb. So these midpoints can make a big difference. So Nicklaus shows up very solid because of the additional grand trine, the additional midpoint structures. Very, very strong pattern. Also Saturn at the Sun-Uranus midpoint, about a degree mid-orb, also reinforcing. So very, very solid. He also has the Jupiter square Mars and Jupiter conjunct Sun, so Jupiter gets involved a little bit. So other planets getting involved. He meets our criterion that we set out. He's got the grand trine. He's got some very powerful midpoint structures. Very strong in the 35th harmonic. Boris Becker, the great tennis player, his 63rd harmonic has Mars, Uranus, and Pluto are conjunct, and Mars and Uranus trine the Sun. So a very powerful combination. But the Pluto-Sun trine is a little out of orb. We allow 5-degree orb, and this is over 6 degrees, so it's out of orb. But we do have the when one of them is out of orb, we have a rule where one of the power planets must aspect 2 others, and Pluto is sextile Jupiter and Saturn. So that meets our criteria. Again, we would rather have all 4 planets within orb, but it does meet the criteria, and plus you get the reinforcing midpoint structures. This one is huge. It's these very powerful midpoint structures that really strengthen it. Mercury, I've got these arrows from the Mars-Uranus conjunction and the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. It's particularly Jupiter. Mercury is at that midpoint. So that really helps give some real power to this, because you got Mercury at Mars, Jupiter, and Jupiter-Uranus midpoint. Largest orb among 3 midpoint structures that are formed is only a degree orb. So it's pretty tightly there. So that strengthens it as well. So basically you've got the Mars, Uranus, Pluto, 2 of them trine the Sun. That's strong. Then you get one of the power planets aspecting 2 others, and then you get reinforcing midpoint structures. Put it all together, you've got a powerful athletic combination. Meets our criteria, plus it is impressive. Tiger Woods was selected by one of the websites as one of the greatest athletes of all time. His is very straightforward, 63rd harmonic, a harmonic that shows up in tennis, baseball, also golf. So we have a great golfer here. 63rd harmonic, Mercury, Uranus, trine Saturn, and Pluto. Grand trine involving 4 planets. So there it is, very, very clear. Also, I'm not showing it, but if you look at his 77th harmonic, you'll see some very interesting patterns in the 77th as well, and probably strengthens it. Okay, so Saturn is opposition Sun-Mars as well. Oh, wow. So in addition to the grand trine, we also have a sesquiquadrat square pattern with one of these planets involved. So that's adding a lot of power. And there's a 70, it shows up in the 77th harmonic at a very high vibration. Maybe that's relevant, maybe not, but for research purposes it's interesting that a very high 77 gets involved. But we don't need that. We have 4 planets in Grand Trine. We have Sun and Mars in hard aspect with one of the planets in the Grand Trine. It's huge. But for research purposes, there are some very high 77. In other words, in the 77th harmonic, some of these planets show up aspected in 8th or 16th harmonic in the 77th. Anyway, that's just for research purposes. We have a huge, powerful patterns going on in the 63rd, and that's what we expect. Okay, Chris Evert, another great tennis player. She is the one player who does not meet, the 1 out of the 14 who does not meet our criteria in the 28th harmonic. She's got a Grand Cross. Sun, Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, 4 power planets, exactly what we want, but 2 aspects are out of orb. The Saturn-Pluto is way out of orb, and the Sun-Jupiter is very slightly out of orb. If she was born 15 minutes later, the Sun-Jupiter would be in orb, there would be only 1 aspect out of orb, and she does have the compensating 2 planets aspecting one of the 4 planets, Mercury and Uranus, in a tight Grand Trine with Pluto. So we saw this also with Jack Nicklaus, the golf player, where 4 planets are in a pattern. 1 is out of orb, but you get a very powerful Grand Trine reinforcing one of the planets. So very, very powerful for Chris Evert. I suspect she probably was born 15 minutes later. But even though at the time, given this time, she doesn't exactly meet our criteria, look at that Grand Trine. I mean, it's very solid lines. Three power, so it brings in Mercury and Uranus into the pattern as well. But she is the one person who, according to our rules, does not quite meet our criteria. Very close, but not quite. Okay, and I don't expect every single athlete, extraordinary athlete, is going to meet our criteria precisely, but we're getting a formula that works extraordinarily well, and we'll refine the formula with future research and get it more and more precise. Willie Mays was selected by one of those websites as one of the greatest players of all time, and he has a pyramid pattern involving 4 planets. It's Pluto conjunct Mercury Uranus and Mercury conjunct Uranus Mars. So Mercury conjunct did I say that right? Mercury conjunct Mars, Uranus, and Pluto conjunct Mercury Uranus. So it's a Mercury, Mars, Uranus, Pluto pyramid pattern. Very, very powerful. And for some reason, I don't know why, I've got some ideas on this, midpoint patterns are very common with baseball players. I think that this may sound strange first, but I think it has to do with the indirect nature of it. That the batting, you're holding a stick, and there's some kind of a balancing act involved in holding a stick which hits the ball, as opposed to other sports which are direct contact. But the batting part of baseball is an indirect. It seems to have something to do with the midpoints showing up a lot. So here's Willie Mays, and specifically not only one of the greatest fielders, but one of the greatest batters of all time, with this midpoint pattern of power, superpower planets, and also he's got the Mars-Saturn conjunction and other things to strengthen this. So very, very interesting how these midpoint patterns are very common, especially with baseball players. But he meets our criteria. He's got the midpoint pattern in one of these 7 based harmonics, and it is, let's go back to Willie Mays, 63rd harmonic that shows up a lot with baseball players. Now, Dan Gable, he showed up in one of the lists. He's a wrestler. I don't think most people ever heard of him, but anyway, he is in one of the lists. He does have Mercury Saturn, Pluto, and Mars, all with an orb in hard aspect in the 21st harmonic. So he meets our criteria. I'm not sure if he really is one of the greatest athletes of all time. Well, he may very well be. And he does meet our criteria of having 4 power planets in a 7-based harmonic. So that's all 14 of them. To summarize, I made a little summary of the patterns. If you want to pause the video to refer to this at any point, I didn't probably discuss every single thing that is involved, but here's a summary of some of the really powerful things that show up in the chart. So if you want to read that or take notes, you can pause this and take notes about what was found in each of the charts. So there's the first 4. Okay, I'll go on to the next 4. Just a little summary of everything involved. I didn't go over every single little thing that I mentioned here. So just a little summary of some of the things in these charts. And here's 3 more. Different things that showed up in those, in case you want to make a note of that. And the last 3 for all 14. So just some notes on what there is in these charts. Okay, I'm going to make another video where I show some of the research that indicates for some of the sports that these patterns really are unusual. Because if you're still skeptical of this, you might say, gee, this probably shows up for everybody. What about people who are not athletes? Well, we did some research on that to show that these patterns really do show up more in athletes than others, and also a way to find out exploratory research methods to find out what's going on. I'll show you one more video on this research on athletes, and then maybe further down the road, maybe 4 or 5, 6 months from now, we're working on predicting when athletes perform better. Very exciting research. Looks like we're on to something. Okay, anyway, we're continuing with this athletic research. I've got one more video in this series for now, which I think you'll find interesting. Okay, thank you very much, my friends. God bless. Namaste.